Linguistic reconstruction is the practice of establishing the features of an unattested ancestor language of one or more given languages. There are two kinds of reconstruction. Internal reconstruction uses irregularities in a single language to make inferences about an earlier stage of that language. That is, it is based on evidence from that language alone. Comparative reconstruction, usually referred to just as reconstruction, establishes features of the ancestor of two or more related languages, belonging to the same language family, by means of the comparative method. A language reconstructed in this way is often referred to as a proto-language, the common ancestor of all the languages in a given family. Examples include Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Dravidian. Texts discussing linguistic reconstruction commonly preface reconstructed forms with an asterisk to distinguish them from attested forms. An attested word from which a root in the proto-language is reconstructed is a reflex. More generally, a reflex is the known derivative of an earlier form, which may be either attested or reconstructed. Reflexes of the same source are cognates. Methods. First, languages that are thought to have arisen from a common proto-language must meet certain criteria in order to be grouped together. This is a process called subgrouping. Since this grouping is based purely on linguistics, manuscripts and other historical documentation should be analyzed to accomplish this step. However, the assumption that the delineations of linguistics always align with those of culture and ethnicity must not be made. One of the criteria is that the grouped languages usually exemplify shared innovation. This means that the languages must show common changes made throughout history. In addition, most grouped languages have shared retention. This is similar to the first criterion, but instead of changes, they are features that have stayed the same in both languages. Because linguistics, as in other scientific areas, seeks to reflect simplicity, an important principle in the linguistic reconstruction process is to generate the least possible number of phonemes that correspond to available data. This principle is again reflected when choosing the sound quality of phonemes, as the one which results in the fewest changes, with respect to the data, is preferred. Comparative reconstruction makes use of two rather general principles, the majority principle and the most natural development principle. The majority principle is the observation that if a cognate set displays a certain pattern, such as a repeating letter in specific positions within a word, it is likely that this pattern was retained from its mother language. The most natural development principle states that some alterations in languages, diachronically speaking, are more common than others. There are four key tendencies. The final vowel in a word may be omitted. Voiceless sounds, often between vowels, become voiced. Phonetic stops become fricatives. Consonants become voiceless at the end of words. Sound construction. The majority principle is applied in identifying the most likely pronunciation of the predicted etymon, the original word from which the cognates originated. Since the most natural development principle describes the general directions in which languages appear to change, one can seek these indicators out. For example, from the word cantar, Spanish, and chanter, French, one can argue that, because phonetic stops generally become fricatives, the cognate with the stop, k, is older than the cognate with the fricative. The former is most likely to more closely resemble the
TESOL and uploaded this video for BS English students. Having more than 25 research papers, he also taught at many foreign universities. He was presently admitted to a postdoctoral study at a Canadian university. Join Applied Linguistics group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at
Methods of Language Reconstruction. From 2 million years before Christ onwards, man gradually became ready for the use of language. However, with no evidence available, the structure of the first language will perhaps never be known. Yet by a method of language comparison, former systems of human communication, so-called proto-languages, can be reconstructed. The underlying principles of language reconstruction constitute the focus of this lecture. In particular, we will discuss the following issues. What exactly is a proto-language? And how can we compare languages? And last, but not least, what sort of linguistic data can be used for the comparative method? Let's start with proto-languages. A proto-language is a hypothetical or reconstructed, typically extinct language. It is not known directly, rather it is a linguistic reconstruction that is formulated by applying the comparative method. A well-known example is Indo-European. Or to be precise, Proto-Indo-European. This is the reconstructed common ancestor of the Indo-European languages. It comprises most European and about one-third of all languages, and is assumed to have been spoken in Central Europe and in South Asia between 600 and 400 years before Christ. The Indo-Europeans probably lived in Central Europe before they began to travel east and west between 3500 and 2500 before Christ. It was reconstructed by August Schleicher, who you can see over here, who published his results, in his monumental work, A Compendium of the Comparative Grammar of the Indo-European Languages. Other reconstructed languages are, for example, Proto-Afroasiatic, Proto-Dravidian, Proto-Altaic, and Proto-Eskimo-Aleut. Some linguists among them, for example Joseph Greenberg and a number of Russian linguists, discern similarities among these proto-languages, such as in the European Africa, Afroasiatic and the others, and postulated a common ancestor to all these languages, which he called Nostratic. The nostalgic hunter-gatherers would have occupied all of Europe, northern Africa, and large parts of Asia from an origin in the Middle East, perhaps around 15,000 years before Christ. Yet, all this is still very speculative. Well, and the story can even be extended, presupposing a monogenetic view of language origin. That is a hypothesis that all languages have a common origin. The earliest proto-languages could have a common ancestor. Well, according to Marie Drouin, a well-known typologist, it could be called Proto-Sapiens. You might also want to use the term proto-human, proto-world, prototype restrict to name a few, but this is all very, very speculative. So let us now look at the principles of reconstructing such proto-languages in more detail. In the 18th century, scholars began to compare groups of languages in a systematic way to see whether there were any correspondences between them. Evidence of a common origin for groups of languages was readily available in Europe, and by the beginning of the 19th century the hypothesis emerged that there was once a language from which the many languages of Eurasia derived. As already mentioned, this proto-language came to be called Indo-European, or to be absolutely precise, Proto-Indo-European. The standard way of reconstructing such ancestor languages is referred to as the comparative method. Now, the comparative method is a way of systematically comparing a series of languages in order to show a historical relationship between them. Scholars begin by identifying a set of formal similarities and differences between the languages, thus trying to reconstruct an earlier state from which all forms could have. Let us look at the word or the phrase the book in the Romance languages in order to illustrate the comparative method. Now you all know that in Spanish we would say el libro. In French it is le livre. In Italian we have in libro. And in Portuguese un libro. The equivalence of the book. In looking at the word book, we can find amazing similarities. All these forms start with a lateral consonant l. Then we have an unrounded high front vowel, which in some languages may be lengthened. In others it is short. The next segment is either a void alveolar plosive or some sort of labial dental fricative, so we have this sort of variation. And then we have some sort of R, which can either be alveolar A or even uvular or velar. Well, and then in some of these languages, we have a vowel, so let's represent it like this. If Latin, the common ancestor language to these Romance languages, no longer existed, it would thus be possible to reconstruct a proto-word such as liver or liver, perhaps with the schwa between lib and r, in order to ease the articulation of the word. And that sort of proto-word would be very close to the real word in Latin, which is of course Libra. Exactly this reasoning is used for cases where the parent language no longer exists. For example, when the forms in Greek and Sanskrit form a classical languages are compared in order to reconstruct the Indo-European proto-word. Such words, by the way, are often marked with an initial asterisk. This principle, which we have just applied, is referred to as cognate comparison. This method was introduced in the 19th century by the Neo-Grammarians, a group of German philologists at the University of Leipzig. So let's look at cognate comparison in more detail. Central to this method is the comparison of cognates. That is, words from different languages with a similar orthographical and phonological shape denoting the same thing. Numbers are very good in this respect, so let's once more illustrate this principle, this time supported by audio evidence from the language index on the virtual Linguistics campus, and I will now load the cognate comparison component of the language index. Here we are. So let's simply first of all listen to the number 3 in the following languages. Let's start with Spanish. And next one is English. Let's move on to German. Now here is Polish. And finally, let's take Ukrainian. Now, what have we found? In Spanish we have. In English, the German word for 3 was dry. In Czech, we have, well, somewhere here, Kai in Polish. And finally, we heard. Now, in looking at these words, we see amazing parallels. Some languages have an alveolar plosive in the initial position, others have an affricate like Czech or Polish, or a fricative, as in English. The next segment is in many languages, some sort of R again, which can be an approximate, a trill or a fricative. And then all languages have one vowel, which is some sort of high front vowel. The similarities are amazing. So in such a list of cognates, systematic phonological correspondences emerge. They imply that these languages are genetically related. The evaluation of such correspondences allows the reconstruction of earlier phonological stages and eventually, the sound system of a now extinct ancestor language. In this case Indo-European. The proto-word for 3, by the way, has been reconstructed. Has something like trace, and in order to signal that this is a proto-word, let's put an asterisk in front of it. Trace using this method of cognate comparison. The main philologists of the 19th century, in particular the Neo-Grammarians, established principled relationships between the languages spoken in Europe. And then there was someone called Jacob Grimm, generally known as the author of fairy tales, but of course is also known as a linguist, and he discovered some principled relationships between the classical languages Sanskrit, Greek and Latin on the one hand, and the Germanic languages on the other. Let's look at his discovery in more detail. In taking the word for father, we will find the following words in Sanskrit. You would say Peter. In classical Greek, you would say pater. In Latin it would be pater, and in English of course father is British. Now if we look at the initial elements, we have in the classical languages bilabial plosive and in English labiodental fricative, so this is what we have, and if we inspect further data we can generalize this sort of relationship to the following. If we have an initial voiceless plosive in one of the classical languages, we will get a fricative in with the same place of articulation or a similar place of articulation in the Germanic languages. This is just one observation. Here is another one. Now let's look at the word for brother in these languages. In Sanskrit it would be something like. In classical Greek, frater frater sorry. In Latin it would be frater, and in English we get of course brother. And again, if we look just at the initial segments, you will find that we have some sort of fricative in the classical languages and a bilabial plosive in English, and also in the other Germanic languages. So we could generalize this as a sort of rule, some sort of affricate bilabial element. Plosive or fricative comes out as a bilabial plosive in the Germanic languages, and here is the generalization. This observation, with further generalizations, has become known as Grimm's law, or the first consonantal shift. And as I said earlier on, it goes back to Jacob Grimm. Jacob Grimm is, of course, this one here on our picture, together with his brother. And this first consonantal shift that distinguishes Germanic, on the one hand from the classical languages in the European languages, on the other, has been known as Grimm's law. Or, as I said, the first consonantal shift. Now this sort of cognate comparison can even be more complex. Now, if we compare some languages, like for example from top to bottom, English, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and German, and we look at the cognates in it. For example, we could look at the representation of the verb give, which is marked in red here. Or we could look at the cognate breed, broad bird, bird browse, broad in these languages. Well, then we see amazing similarities, and in fact all these languages are Germanic languages. However, we could even say more. We could now say something about word order principles. Here we have imperative sentences, and obviously all these languages have the verb in the initial position. In German, the word order is slightly deviant, but it is also possible, but normally the verb is also in the initial position. Or can we make statements about morphological complexity? Well, if we look at these languages and look at the word for daily, for example, we have an adverb. We have an adverb here, and you see the different representation of adverbs plus some morphological element to be added. Illustrate the degrees of morphological complexity of these languages. So in comparing existing with extinct languages or comparing them with other existing languages with each other's mind-boggling parallels emerge. They can best be explained by assuming principled relationships between them. That humans could speak a long time ago is undisputed. Yet the exact structure of their early communication systems will probably never be revealed. However, and I hope to have shown this in this lecture, the principles of language comparison allow to reconstruct formal languages without having written, let alone spoken, evidence. Using this comparative method, we can reconstruct proto-languages such as, for example, Indo-European or Proto-Altaic. According to some linguists, we can even go further back and postulate a common ancestor language to all of these. We found out that Nostratic could be a suitable name, and even further back Nostratic could be grouped with other reconstructed proto-languages. Eventually, then, we could find a first language spoken on our planet. Well, proto-world, proto-sapiens, proto-human, or whatever name we would like to find for it. However, I hope to have shown that this involves a high degree of speculation. Language reconstruction redirects here, not to be confused with language revitalization or conlang.
Dr. KHALID MALIK, the founder of Applied Linguistics Groups, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL and uploaded this video for BS English students. Having more than 25 research papers, he also taught at many foreign universities. He was presently admitted to a postdoctoral study at a Canadian university. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at